So this seminar is about tapping practices to maximize yields over the long term. And really, when we're talking about that, we're talking about practices to optimize yields and sustainability. And although I'm going to present a lot of research today, and I'm the one sitting here talking to you, the research that I'm presenting is the work of a lot of different people, not just me. It's work by Dr. Perkins, Mark Iselhart, and the whole crew at the Proctor Center. So I just wanted to remind everyone of that a lot of people contributed to the work that I'm going to be speaking about today. So let's start from the basics. We know that each year when we tap a tree for sap collection, a couple of things happen. We know that the tree's response to that tap hole wound is going to generate or result in the generation of a column of non-conductive wood above and below the tap hole that is going to be permanently non-conductive, not only for sap collection, but also for water transport within the tree. And then we also know that we're removing a portion of the tree's carbohydrate reserves. However, at the same time, in the same year, the tree is also going to be adding new conductive wood to the tapping zone of that tree each year in radial growth. And so when we talk about sustainable sap collection practices, what do we mean? And there are a lot of different definitions that we could make to meet the word sustainable. But one way that we can look at this and what could be sustainable, or what we could consider sustainable sap collection, is a condition where the addition of new conductive wood outpaces the amount of non-conductive wood that we've generated by tapping. And along with that, that the volume of conductive wood in the tapping zone remains very high. So literally the opposite of what's going on here. And this provides us a measure of sustainability, or a condition of sustainability, from both a health and a yields perspective. So from a tree health perspective, maintaining a high amount of conductive wood in the tapping zone means that the tree is going to have a functional water transport system, a lower potential risk of developing disease or decay. So good conditions for the tree and the tree health. And then this condition also gives us sustainability with respect to yields. The larger the amount of conductive wood in the tapping zone, this gives us a high probability of hitting clean conductive wood when we're tapping and getting good yields. And it's worth pointing out that the radial growth rates of trees, because we're making this balance on the addition of conductive wood, it's the radial growth rate of trees, how much it's growing annually each year, that underlies, and is sort of the linchpin of this whole thing, underlies the sustainability of tapping practices both for tree health as well as for sap yields in the future. And because tree health affects growth rates, all of this ends up being a sort of circular, and affecting every aspect of this affects every other aspect of this. So because radial growth rates are sort of the foundation of this, we can start with, what do we know about the impacts of tapping on tree growth? And to begin to look at this, the first study that we did looking at the impacts of tapping on growth, we wanted to do a study where we just wanted to get an idea of what are the growth rates of trees tapped with our current high yield sap collection practices. And so for this study, we collected increment cores from over 800 trees, and these were healthy trees. They had only been tapped with a single tap. They were codominant or dominant in the canopy. And we collected them in 6 different diameter classes in uniform stands at 18 different operations that at the time were using relatively high yield production practices. So high yields of vacuum, at high levels of vacuum, and yields of at least 0.4 of a gallon of syrup per tap for at least the past 5 years when we were doing this study, and this was in 2010. And so once we had those increment cores, we measured the growth rates of those trees over the past 5 years that those higher yield sap collection practices have been used. And what we found was this. These are the growth rates of the trees in the different diameter classes in that study across all of those 18 sites. And when we look at this and try to let it tell us something about, well, is this sustainable? Are these growth rates good? Are they bad? Are they kind of neutral? Really just looking at them on their own, they don't really tell us much with respect to the sustainability of our sap collection practices. So in order to put these growth rates into context, we had to go another step. And what we chose to do in this study was to use a model of the tapping zone that estimates we use that model to estimate what are the minimum growth rates needed to maintain those conditions of sustainability that we just talked about. So to maintain that very high level of conductive wood over time when we were using standard tapping practices. And the practices that we investigate in this study were the conservative tapping guidelines outlined in the North American Maple Producers Manual, which were in the second edition of that, a 2-inch tapping depth, a 5/16 spout, and a 30-inch drop line. And so what you can see here, we've got those measured growth rates in orange, and the blue bars are the minimum growth rates that we estimated we needed to have in order to achieve that condition of sustainability. So at first glance, this looks pretty good. All of our measured growth rates are higher than the minimum that we estimated they needed to be. So looking at it very big picture like this, the average growth rates of the trees that we measured in our study that had been tapped with high yield sap collection practices were generally higher than the minimum that we estimated they needed to be in order to maintain that sustainable level of conductive wood over time when following those tapping practices that we were looking at. So that was good news. However, when we drill down a little bit, remember those bars were means of 18 different sites and many, many trees at those sites. So while the big picture was kind of rosy, when we drill down into those averages and look at some of the individual numbers, things get a little bit more interesting. And so what you can see here, these are the growth rates at each of those 18 different sites. And so if we just focus in on the growth rates of our 10-inch trees in this study, you can see right away that there's a huge level of variation just between sites A and B. The difference in the growth rates of 10-inch trees are double one another. So there's a lot of variation within trees and within trees at the same site and within the growth rates of trees at different sites. And of course, anyone that works in the woods like you guys already know that. There's many, many things that affect the growth rates of an individual tree. So when we applied our minimum growth rates to not the overall average that we saw in this study, but rather the growth rates of all 800 individual trees, we saw something different. And that was that between 27 and 41% of the individual trees in this study had growth rates that were below those estimated minimums. And so while the big picture on average, growth rates were pretty good, when we were looking at the individual trees that we studied, there were plenty of them that did not make the cut when following those existing tapping practices. So hold this thought in your minds for a moment. We'll return to this at the end of the presentation today. So that was one study, the first study that we did looking at the impacts of tapping on radial growth. But in that study, we were using increment cores to kind of go back in time and see and kind of make an inference of, well, what are the growth rates of these trees? But in science, really the gold standard, if you want to know what is the effect of something on something else, then what you need to do is conduct a controlled experiment where you hold everything else equal except the variable of interest. And in this case, it's tapping and sap collection. So what we did in our next study, we established a controlled experiment to examine the long-term effects of tapping and sap extraction on growth and health. To do this, we took a stand that had never been tapped before, so all the trees were fresh, never tapped, and we split them up into 3 treatment groups. A third of those trees remained untapped over time. A third of them were set up to have sap collection under gravity conditions, so sort of traditional sap collection. And then the other third of them were set up to have sap collected under vacuum sap collection, so high levels of carbohydrate extraction. And you can see, this is a picture of where they are in the stand, so you can see that the 3 treatment groups are spread out along the stand equally. They're also matched to have the same size in each treatment group, and they're all healthy dominant or codominant trees. And so what we do, we tap the treatment trees each year for sap collection and actually measure how much of the carbohydrate resources that we are removing. But we are also, more importantly, measuring the diameter growth rate of those trees each year so that we can get an idea of, is there potentially an impact of tapping and sap collection on the radial growth of trees? And so we began the study in 2013, and these are the average diameters of each of the treatment groups, the untapped controls, the gravity trees, and the vacuum sap collection trees. And what you can see, I can tell you that, first of all, there's no significant difference in the way that these trees are growing so far as of the last time we measured them in the fall of 2020. And basically they're all growing very similar. You can look at these graphs and see that there is not, you really don't see any difference between any of them. If we look at the overall change from beginning in 2013 to now, for the 3 different treatment groups, we can see that our control trees and our gravity sap collection trees have grown about 13%, whereas the vacuum sap collection trees have grown 12%. And this is nowhere near a significant difference. But what this does indicate is that perhaps if this small difference over the long term could potentially translate into a real and significant difference. So, when we talk about maple production and sap collection, we're not talking about a 10-year prospect. We're talking about a 50 to 100-year prospect. So really, the results of this study and what we're interested in are likely to be those long-term results, those potential long-term effects. So we will continue this study, and hopefully I will be here in the future, long into the future, presenting the results to see, does that 1% difference, which is not significant now, does that translate into a more significant difference over time? So that remains to be seen. And one of the biggest drawbacks, so that study is awesome, and we're super excited to be doing it. But one of the drawbacks of it is that it's only at a single site. And we all know that site is a really important variable that can impact the way the trees grow. The soil fertility, the microclimate impacts, all of those things can impact the way that trees grow. And in fact, in another study done in Quebec, they found that while there was not a consistent effect of tapping on radial growth, that if there was one, that it was likely that soil fertility could play a role in that. And for those reasons, we wanted to establish the same type of study, but at multiple sites, not just at the Proctor Center. So we did this beginning in 2017. We have basically the same experimental setup, or a similar experimental setup, at 15 sites across Vermont and a little bit of New York. And at each of these sites, we have 50 trees. Half of them are going to remain untapped and half of them are tapped as usual. And like in the other study, we measure their diameter growth annually as well as their crown health to give an idea of their overall health. So this study was first tapped in 2018. We have funding to go at least 6 years with this study and hopefully more. And hopefully what we will do is have these data to integrate with what we're getting at the Proctor Center site to have a really robust understanding of what, if any, impact of tapping is on radial growth rates of trees. Okay, so that's kind of where we are with growth rates. So how do our tree growth rates, our tapping practices, yields, factors related to the tree, and overall sustainability, how do these all interact? And the first thing that we can start off with is something that you don't need a research seminar to tell you. It is that tapping practices impact yields. So we all know that our tapping practices impact what kind of yields we're going to get in the current year. You don't need a scientific study to tell you that. But the benefit of having a scientific study on some of these things is to be able to quantify those impacts, to put some actual numbers on what are the impacts of these practices on yields so that we can help make a more data-based decision about what practices are going to be best in our situation. So perhaps the biggest practice, or the practice with the biggest potential impact on yield, is tap hole depth. And, like I just said, all of us know that deeper tap holes are going to make more sap usually, but it does help to know how much more. And so we completed a study. We did a 3-year study looking at the yields from various tap hole depths at the Proctor Center. And actually, the results were fairly interesting and somewhat surprising. So these are the syrup yield equivalent from each of these tap holes of each of these depths, and they're related to the yield from a 1.5-inch tap hole. So if we set the yields from a 1.5-inch tap hole, which is kind of standard, how do those other depths compare to that? And so you can see right off the bat that a 1-inch tap hole, or 1-inch tap holes, produced substantially less than 1.5-inch tap holes. So they yielded about 60% the yield of a 1.5-inch tap hole. So definitely some reduction in yields there. But then as we go above or to deeper depths than 1.5 inches, we can see that it's something kind of interesting happen. Once we get above that, there really is no difference in the impact on yield. Whether you're going to 2 inches or 2.5 inches, there really is the same gain relative to the 1.5-inch tap hole. Now that's not saying that every 2.5-inch tap hole is going to be about the same as a 2-inch tap hole, but overall, the overall effect, it seems like the 2-inch tap hole is really, you're getting the maximum bang for your buck. You're getting the maximum amount of additional sap yield that you're going to get without the increased non-conductive wood that you would get from a 2.5-inch deep tap hole. Tap hole diameter is another practice that can impact yields. And again, this is kind of just a physics matter. So bigger holes tend to make more sap. And what we see based on the results of our work is it's a fairly linear relationship with increasing hole size to increasing yields. And this is, of course, these are studies where we have the same material for the spouts and equal attention to leak checking, which is really important in a study of something like spout diameter. But for example, we see about a 10% reduction in yield going from 5/16 inch to 1/4 inch. So a 10% difference, a small difference, but not an insignificant one. And this is actually something that was found at Center Acer as well. They did a very similar study and actually found almost an identical difference. They found an 11.5% difference between 1/4 inch spouts and 5/16 inch spouts. So again, the spout diameter is something that impacts yields. And then of course, the number of taps per tree is likely to impact yields. And now we had some data on this from Tim Wilmot from about a decade or so ago, but we wanted to repeat the study, especially with the higher levels of vacuum that we're able to achieve right now, because that can impact how this works out. So we recently completed a 2-year study looking at the yields from 1 tap versus 2. And so you can see here in 2019, for example, you can see that the yields from trees with 2 taps was bigger, though not double or anything like that, but of course greater than the yields from trees with 1 tap. However, in 2020, we were somewhat surprised to see that there was basically no difference in yield between trees with 1 tap or trees with 2 taps. And this was kind of surprising, but also not so surprising. What we saw was that with the smaller trees in the study, they were more likely, the smaller trees with 2 taps, were more likely to yield equivalently to a single tap. And so what we're seeing with higher levels of vacuum, especially with smaller trees, or smaller trees for the range of trees tapped with 2 taps, is that vacuum is able to propagate within the tree. So at higher levels of vacuum, there's a higher chance that that first tap hole is going to cannibalize sap from the second tap hole. And the smaller the diameter of tree that you're using for this, the greater the effect is going to be. So generally speaking, although we can increase the yield with a number of taps per tree, the gains are generally going to be less the smaller the tree that you have and the higher the vacuum you go. And we're actually repeating this study again with even larger trees to kind of help us get a more robust estimate of that. So those results I'll present sometime in the future. Okay, so we know, of course, not rocket science, deeper, larger tap holes, more taps per tree, generally speaking, are going to give us higher yields. But that is also going to give us more non-conductive wood. So how do we put these things together? So again, another very basic principle is that tapping practices impact the amount of non-conductive wood that's generated. How much do they impact it? That is a very good question. Generally speaking, the volume of non-conductive wood generated is proportional to the volume of the tap hole. So bigger holes make more non-conductive wood. However, we see in studies of this that this is highly variable. So for example, in this study that we did at the Proctor Center, the average was 50 times the size of the hole that was drilled. But you can see that the minimum was as low as 14 times and the maximum was 200 times. And these, I should say, were all completely clean tap holes. Those were tap holes that did not intercept any pre-existing non-conductive wood. And when that happens, the amount of non-conductive wood explodes even more. So you would see maximum levels far greater than 200%, 200 times the size of the tap hole. And so these are just some examples. This is kind of a rarity. These are 2-inch wide segments going above and below the tap hole. And so in this rather magical tree, you have that non-conductive wood column disappearing within 4 or 5 inches of the tap hole, both above and below. More realistically, we see something like this, where we have the non-conductive wood continuing and continuing. This is 12 inches above the tap hole and it's still not gone. And down here, I think my video is blocking this, but this is 14 inches below the tap hole and that non-conductive wood is still there. So that is probably a little closer to reality most times, although like I said, it's very variable. And then you have issues where you hit something pre-existing, either that central column of discolored wood that's present in many trees. Notably, it's often closer to the surface in a red maple than it is in a sugar maple. It could be a branch scar, it could be pre-existing tap hole non-conductive wood, whatever it is, when the tap hole, the response to the tap hole intercepts that pre-existing non-conductive wood, the amount of non-conductive wood basically explodes. And this is in part because it's intercepting wood that is already not able to signal or defend itself and wall itself off. So once that's intercepted, it's kind of no holds barred after that. And if it's an area of already existing decay that's been compartmentalized, then you have even bigger problems. And this is just to show sort of how when that something like this happens, you're going above and below the tap hole and sort of you're getting more non-conductive wood. It's not dissipating like you would see in response to a typical tap hole. And these are just other examples of how much that new non-conductive wood can sort of travel, so to speak. And so tapping practices not only impact the amount of non-conductive wood that we have and that we add to the tree each year, they also impact, and the tapping practices that we choose impact the chances of hitting non-conductive wood each year when we tap. And the way this kind of structures is, if we think about the tapping zone of a tree, and this scenario works for bucket collection too, But we're going to keep it simple with different geometries, but we're going to keep it focused on tubing collection systems for this presentation. So we consider the tapping zone of a tree the area of the tree that is accessible by that sap drop line. And instead of being some like complex cylinder, if we unfold that tapping zone from the tree, we can actually see that the tapping zone is just a simple three-dimensional rectangle that is defined at least in 2 dimensions by the practices that we choose. So obviously the width of the tapping zone is defined by how big around the tree is. So that one we don't have any control over except for choosing which trees that we tap. But the other 2 dimensions are things that we choose. The height of the tapping zone is defined by the length of the drop line, and the depth of the tapping zone is defined by how deep we choose or set our tap hole depth. And so the 3 of those multiplied together give us the total volume of the tapping zone. So 2 of the dimensions there are controlled by us that give us the maximum potential amount of conductive wood available in the tapping zone of a tree is controlled by our tapping practices. And then of course, as we just talked about, our tapping practices also determine how much non-conductive wood we add to the tapping zone each year, because the bigger the hole, the bigger the amount of non-conductive wood, generally speaking. So this is going to determine each year how much non-conductive wood is added to the tapping zone. So the proportion of the tapping zone that is made up of non-conductive wood is actually equivalent to the chances of hitting non-conductive wood when we're tapping. So in other words, if 20% of the tapping zone is non-conductive wood, then we have a 20% chance of hitting it when we're tapping. If 80% of the tapping zone is non-conductive wood, then we have an 80% chance of hitting it when tapping. So as you can see, as non-conductive wood accumulates, the chances of hitting it increase. Higher percentages equal higher chances. And it is worth saying again that tree diameter rate is the keystone, the thing that underlies all of this, because we are relying on tree diameter or tree diameter growth to add conductive wood. Each year, when the tree adds conductive wood to the outside, it is not only adding new conductive wood, but it is also helping some of the pre-existing non-conductive wood get removed from the tapping zone because we have growth beyond our tapping depth. And so by determining how much conductive wood is added annually, it determines how much non-conductive wood is present in the tapping zone at any given time and the chances of tapping into it or into tapping conductive wood. And all of this makes a difference, and it matters because tapping into non-conductive wood impacts yields. And again, this is something that you don't need a research seminar or data to tell you. We all know that tapping into brown wood is going to get us less sap. But what's important and helpful to understand is how much less. And my colleague Mark Isselhart did a really awesome study where he collected purposefully drilled into non-conductive wood into old tap holes and measured the sap yield from those holes and conductive wood, tap holes drilled into conductive wood in the same trees. And what he found was that on average, the reduction in yield from tapping into non-conductive wood was 75%, or in other words, 75% less than tap holes drilled into conductive wood. And now, of course, what he found in his study also is, and we observe this too, just working in the woods, the more non-conductive wood you hit, the greater the impacts on yield. So if you just graze a little bit of non-conductive wood, you'll have better yields from that tap hole potentially than something that drilled directly into it. But on average in his study, the reduction was 75%. So yields from tap holes drilled into non-conductive wood are significantly lower. And so the greater the chances of hitting non-conductive wood, the greater the chances we have of reduced yields. And before we put this kind of all together, there are a couple of things relative to tree size that I wanted to mention. These are other tree factors to consider. I mean, we all know that yield generally increases with tree size. we find in our work, especially under good levels of vacuum, that you get about a ½ pound of syrup yield per inch increase in diameter. But there's a lot of variation in that. And really the bottom line to consider at this moment is that for small trees, the yields really aren't very good. So we're talking about trees smaller than we would generally tap under current tapping guidelines. And then with these smaller trees, we have each time we add a tap hole of the same size in a smaller tree, the non-conductive wood that's generated is going to take up an increasingly large amount or large proportion of the tapping zone of that tree. You've got the same amount of non-conductive wood being added to a much smaller volume. So non-conductive wood is going to accumulate much faster in smaller trees than in larger trees. And then a final sort of nail in the coffin for small trees, or for many small trees, is that our smaller trees are often not in the main canopy. So when we're putting a tap hole in an 8 or a 9-inch tree, oftentimes those trees are trees we are thinning with a tapping bit, and those aren't in the main canopy. And because of that, or in part because of that, they often have much slower growth rates than their codominant and dominant neighbors. So you can see that here, again, going back to our original study on growth rates, the codominant and dominant trees in that study are the growth rates in orange. The suppressed and intermediate trees in the same stands had growth rates much lower than their codominant and dominant neighbors. So this also is going to make worse an already rapid non-conductive wood accumulation in these smaller trees. So it is something to think about when you're making your decisions about which trees to tap and which trees to thin. So when I'm talking about tapping practices to maximize yields, because I'm always and often talking about what practices to use to maximize the yields that you're able to obtain from trees. But realistically, what we mean when we say that is that we want to maximize yields for the long term. So the tapping practices that we use today need to balance the yields that we want to get today and the accumulation of non-conductive wood that's going to result from those tapping practices as a function of what's going on with the growth rates of our trees, how big they are, how much non-conductive wood is already present in them, because all of this is going to determine future yields. As non-conductive wood accumulates, our chances of hitting it increase and our chances of getting reduced yields increase. And that's why I often tend to say optimizing yields and sustainability versus maximizing yields. So how to put this in practice? Obviously, the first thing that you want to do is know something about how your trees are growing and how much non-conductive wood is already there. For tree growth rate, you don't need to do something fancy pants like getting increment cores and hiring a consultant to do that, because it is laborious, it's very labor intensive. You can simply monitor the diameter of a marked location on a subset of trees in your stands or established permanent plots. It helps to get some assistance from a forester to do this, but it can be simply done. And over the course of a few years, you'll have a fairly good idea of how trees are growing at your site. And the next thing, or really I probably should say the first thing, one of the most important things that you could do is to is to count the amount of times you're hitting non-conductive wood when you're tapping. Are you hitting it at 1 out of every 20 holes, 1 out of every 100 holes, or 1 out of every 10? How often are you hitting non-conductive wood? Because the amount of non-conductive wood that you're already dealing with that you don't have any control over anymore is going to greatly affect what tapping practices you're able to use to maximize yields over the long term. And so then first and foremost, before you even get out the tapping bit, you're going to want to do things, if possible, to promote the growth and health of your trees. So in 99.9% of cases, this is going to involve forest management and probably some thinning and other stand improvement activities. And this is where it's really important and helpful to work with a professional forester, someone that has experience and familiarity with working in a sugar bush and not just a timber stand. They can really help you optimize your management plan to help really promote the growth of your crop trees in lots of different ways. And this might also entail things like liming or other soil amendments, which can be helpful when they're needed and really only when they're needed. And then other best practices like taking care of the health of your trees by making good roads, taking care of your roads, taking care of your trails, really just operating every day and in every way with an understanding that keeping healthy trees is going to maximize your yields and your economic returns from whatever you're doing. And then the next step is to, over time, choose your tapping practices to balance the accumulation of non-conductive wood that's going to result from them and the yields that you can get from them with how well your trees are growing and how much non-conductive wood is there. So you're going to want to aim for the tapping practices that can give you the maximum yields that you would like to obtain in the current year, but in a way that's going to allow non-conductive wood accumulation to be minimized over time so that you're not shooting yourself in the foot for yields in 10 years from now. And that can begin with practices that actually don't impact current year yields. Remember that the tapping zone, the size of the tapping zone determines how much non-conductive wood, or sorry, how much conductive wood we have to work with in the first place. So simply by implementing practices that increase the size of the tapping zone, we can start things off on a completely different foot and give us a lot less non-conductive wood accumulation in the tapping zone of our trees. So things like increasing the length of drop lines can be a really simple way to increase the long-term yields from our trees. And so I promised I would come back to this way back in the beginning, like what was that, like 2 hours ago? Sorry. In the beginning, I told you about a study where when we looked at the individual growth rates of the trees that we studied, that between 27 and 40% of them didn't have growth rates good enough to keep the level of conductive wood high enough for sustainability with those existing tapping practices. But in that same study, when we increased the drop line to just 36 inches compared to 30 inches, all of a sudden, we now go from having 27 to 40% of trees not having growth rates good enough to 8 to 27%. And so what we can see is that just that 6 inches of increased size of the tapping zone makes an enormous difference in terms of the long-term sustainability of our tapping practices. And we have not done anything to impact our current year yields at all. Another option is also, of course, moving the lateral line system vertically, which basically accomplishes the same thing. So working with the snow or lack of snow to move that is just another simple way to do that, or can be a simple way to do that. And then third is tapping below the lateral line. This is basically the same thing as increasing your drop line length, only double. It gives you access to close to double the size of the tapping zone. And when you are implementing this well, so with good sanitation, really good sanitation, and best practices and good levels of vacuum, we see no difference in yields from tap holes that are below or above the lateral line. And so those give us a lot of practices already that can help us increase long-term yields and sustainability without impacting today's yield or this year's yield. But in certain situations, that may not be enough. So then we move to practices that can impact current year yields. Things that will affect both the amount of non-conductive wood that we're adding, but also our yield. So tapping depth and diameter and the number of taps per tree each year. So we saw again in that previous study, when we took a step further and reduced the tapping depth from 2 inches to 1.5 inches, now all of a sudden instead of that outrageous like 20 to 41% of trees not having growth rates that were adequate to maintain a high level of conductive wood, by reducing the tapping depth and with that 36-inch drop line, now only 1 to 11% of the trees in that study had growth rates that weren't sufficient to meet that level. So very small changes made very big differences in the terms of the amount of conductive wood over time, and really that is equivalent to our yields over time. So in real life, if you've got trees that aren't growing very well, you've got lots of non-conductive wood, so you're hitting it maybe greater than 5 or 10% of the time, obviously before you do anything, you're going to maybe want to think about whether thinning or other forest management activities are appropriate, or look at the size of trees that you're tapping. And then first things first, if you can, if it's an option, do things that don't impact yields. Increase the length of drop lines, tap below the lateral, and I would probably say reducing the number of taps per tree, especially at high levels of vacuum and smaller tree size, is going to impact yields the least of any of these other practices. But then if you need to, go to a shallower depth, maybe a smaller diameter, and see what happens. Then over time, if you find that you're hitting non-conductive wood less and less frequently, so now it's 1% of the time or 0.5% of the time, then you may be able to go back to a deeper depth and a 5/16 inch spout. So these are all things that are meant to be adjusted over time to help you get the best yields possible this year, but also make sure that you're getting the best yields possible 10, 20 years from now. And again, to do this, we want to choose the tapping practices that balance yields and sustainability for your trees. You're going to aim for the tapping practices that result in the maximum yields possible to result in a level of non-conductive wood for the growth rates and health of your trees that are going to be low enough to support high yields in the future. And so thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, I invite you to email me, and I look forward to seeing you guys really soon.